The Dutch East India Company was formed by the governing body of the Dutch Republic, known as the States General. This mega corporation was established in 1602 with an aim to monopolize the spice trade. With massive financial support and legal aid to wage war, this company dominated European trade for the next 200 years. The Dutch government gave relaxations to the company, and the company was free to frame its legal system. They could wage wars, form settlements, and be the formal colonial agency. The charter issued by the States General gave the company's control to Gentlemen 17 or 17 directors. They were given extensive authority and sovereignty. In an instance, the Gentlemen 17 overtly told the States General in 1644 that the trading centers and places that were captured by the company in the East were the property of individuals and that the state did not have any claim over these places. The Gentlemen 17 managed the affairs of the company while residing in the Netherlands itself. The headquarters of the Dutch East India Company was established at Batavia near modern Jakarta in Indonesia. Here, a Governor General was appointed along with a small council to advise him. The Governor General was responsible for supervising and controlling the trading activities of the Dutch East India Company in India and the Far East. However, India was not initially a hot catch for the Dutch. The Dutch had an eye on the Indonesian islands given their keen interest in the spice trade. India just happened to be a trading depot. However, once they realized the importance of Indian textiles, there was no looking back. Soon they realized that India was an unavoidable link that facilitated trade with Southeast Asia. Calico was a sought-after cloth from Calicut in the Malabar coast. This cloth was exported by the Portuguese, who introduced it in Europe. Since the Dutch saw Indian cloth as an essential commodity of exchange, the Dutch trading centers in India became the trading depots. These depots were used for exchanging commodities. The Dutch were not looking for territorial control, as their main interests lay in the Spice Islands. The Dutch soon established their first factory at Masulipatnam in North Coromandel in 1605. Gradually, they expanded their trade network in India to exchange textiles with the spices procured from the Spice Islands of Indonesia or the Malaccas, Banda and Celebes. Indian cloth had such great demand that Hendrik Brouwer, the Governor General of the Dutch settlements in East India from 1632 to 1636, referred to Coromandel as the left arm of the Moluccas. Eventually, the Dutch expanded their trade network and established trading centers in different parts of our country. The notable features of Dutch trade with India were: the Dutch used violence to gain rights over certain products and control over markets with an aim to minimize competition from the natives, something which many others had done before them. The Dutch used strategies like the pass system to keep the Asian adversaries from Indonesia and India at bay and paid low rates to producers in the Spice Islands. By the time the Dutch became a dominant player, the composition of Euro-Indian trade changed. The importance of pepper and spice as major import items from India to Europe had declined, whereas textiles and raw silk imports into Europe increased from 16% to 55% by the end of the 17th century. Goods like cotton, indigo, saltpeter, raw silk, and opium were the major goods traded by the Dutch. For textiles, the Dutch depended on Gujarat and Masulipatnam, whereas raw silk and opium came from Bengal. The Dutch paid the Indian producers in precious metals like gold and silver, woolen and silk textiles, wine, beer, and non-precious metals like lead, mercury, and iron. This was because of their inability to supply Western products in Asia at prices that would generate demand for them. Please remember, an important dimension of this bullion for goods model of Euro-Asian trade was that for the Europeans, the profits were almost entirely derived from the sale of Asian goods in Europe rather than from the sale of European goods in Asia. The Dutch were exempted from paying transit duties in areas like Pulicat route to develop overseas trade in India. Generally, the custom duties charged by the Mughal imperial authorities and other regional rulers were ordinarily the same as that extracted from the Indian merchants. Therefore, the Dutch company operated in the Indian market like other group of Indian merchants without special privileges and restrictions on their activities. After the formation of Dutch East India Company, the Dutch expanded their trade network in the East and in India. They set up factories that served as warehouses and not as manufacturing depots in Masulipatnam in 1605. Later, in Pulicat, Surat, Agra, Pipli, Hooghly, Patna, Chinsura, Kasim Bazar near Murshidabad, Bengal, Balasore, Nagapattinam, presently known as Nagapattinam, and Cochin. Each factory had a factor who was responsible for sending regular reports to Batavia consisting of information about trading activities, import and export of goods, list of ships, and the like. The factory set up at Pulicat in 1610 became the Coromandel Dutch Directorate's headquarters. In 1613, Fort Geldria was established in Pulicat. The governor, who was called director until 1615, exercised control over the Coromandel factories. The second in command was the head of the factory at Masulipatnam. However, the seat of the whole directorate's headquarters was shifted from Pulicat to Nagapattinam in southern Coromandel coast in 1690. This was probably done because the Dutch had constructed a very strong castle in Nagapattinam called the Fort Wif Zinnen. This fort could have served as a very strong fortified base for the Coromandel Dutch Directorate. In general, all Dutch factories had walled compounds with both the living area and storehouse for valuable goods. This was the general structure and composition of Dutch establishments. In 1665, the factories at Bengal were grouped into a separate directorate, and the factory at Hooghly was the station of the Dutch Directorate. The independence of factories at Bengal from the Pulicat Directorate was pivotal in strengthening Dutch trade in Bengal. Now let's talk about the executive body at the Hooghly Chief Factory. Chief factories had a council as a principal executive body chaired by governor, also known as director. Apart from the governor or the director, the council also consisted of the following: an officer to enforce law, a senior factor who looked after the accounts, the factor in charge of the factory's stores, and a few other factors. Whereas the executive functioning of the chief factory at Coromandel Coast was slightly different. It had the office of chief administrator who supervised the accounts of all the factories on the Coromandel Coast before these were sent to Batavia, and also supervised the Coromandel factories. There was also an exclusive council of justice for the coast that judged and punished the Dutch employees working in the respective factories. Thus, the Dutch had fortified factories in India. The Governor-General in Council at Batavia was often dictating terms and regulated the commercial empire entirely. This might have happened due to the long distance and lack of speedy means of communication between the Gentlemen 17, whom we have seen they used to reside in the Netherlands, and the Governor-General in Council. It was the chief link between the chief factory and the board of directors of the VOC. You might be wondering how the Indian rulers let the foreign companies have fortified cities with troops and garrisons in their territories. Well, it is simple. The Dutch were the masters of the sea. The local Indian rulers wanted overseas trade to flourish in India as it would increase their revenue. Thus, they welcomed foreign merchants, gave them concessions to conduct trade, set up factories, and to exercise monopoly as well. The Dutch happened to receive a favorable response from Golconda. Rulers of Golconda granted concessions on customs duty and an exemption from paying duty on cloth. However, not everything was perfect between the company and the Indian rulers. Local officials would evade the orders of the rulers and impose duties. This resulted in clashes between the company and the local officials. For instance, in 1616, the Dutch shut down their factory at Petapuli due to extremely high demands of the local Havaldar. Similarly, the factory at Masulipatnam was also on the verge of being shut down due to extortion and oppression by the local Havaldar. The Dutch abandoned their factory at Hooghly in 1636 due to the harrowing experience from local officials and the intense rivalry with the local merchants. The factory later was reopened in 1645 to 1650. Such skirmishes were common, and even though the Dutch enjoyed complete freedom from tariffs in places like Golconda, they had to resort to armed conflict in the 1680s. As for conducting trade in the west coast, the Dutch got firman from Jahangir, exempting them from the tolls from Burhanpur to Cambay and Ahmedabad. Shah Jahan issued firmans to the Dutch permitting them to trade in Bengal in 1635 and in Surat. The Dutch tried to maintain a good equation with the Indian rulers. The latter wished to promote trade by promoting the establishment of European companies to increase the inflow of the revenue.